I've certainly appreciated watching you dismantle your building and reassemble it. So you weren't shy on using drawings to illustrate your ideas. So well done.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's an incredible amount of work, and you should be applauded for that in terms of like every level of detail. And I did also very much appreciate the kind of beginning presentation, and I want to just start there in a way because the kind of diagrams of starting to sculpt the project and the reasons, you know, why you made the moves you made, I think was very interesting. And there was a moment where you were sort of carving out at the bottom, you know, and I kept thinking that you would end up like having this one point that would sort of touch down, and then all of a sudden it got cut off, which surprised me, you know, because well, it's even more what's sort of holding it up, but just the idea that there is some moment, you know, where I'm entering into this. And I don't know that, you know, the cut corner is as strong a gesture as the fact that I'm starting to float this thing and I carve out and there's one moment where I touch down. I appreciated your move to then cut into the ground, but I think, you know, the idea of how you're connecting this floating volume to the ground is really critical. And then you did a couple things that surprised me. The first one not, where you kind of cut into the center, but then you filled it with this, you know, sort of new crystalline geometry as a volume, as opposed to thinking it as a space that you're carving out of something that you've already cut. And I wanted first for you to sort of respond to that. And the second thing that sort of surprised me in the end was initially there was this contrast in a way between what you started with, how you might be sculpting it, and then what became the kind of void in the center. But what you ended up with is something that's very different, because now the crystal becomes this whole thing as a larger volume, and that skin, which started out being a kind of space, right? Now, at least what it starts to read as is you don't see the difference between the void and that volume, and instead it's a difference of a skin, like just a material condition, just black skin and the crystal inside. And I feel like you lost something in that move, you know, where that's more about surface, but there was something stronger spatially in the first kind of diagram. So
I think how, like, just to address part of it, how we are turning for it spatially, is that the two crystals have always been very structural for us. So the fact that there has been like a void and then we filled it, that was sort of a response to how that space would actually stand up, because we did cut it actually in like our plans, you can see it's a ring, so it's not necessarily just like a single void space. And then like sort of how the skin on the inside starts working is that it's sort of like emerging from the structure and it's cladding around the structure, but also working together to start defining spaces and entries and movement through that space.
Maybe, you know, there's a map here. You're missing something that when someone is close to that facade, the surface there. So here, you have the idea that this hole gives you the connectivity there, and here as well. Or here, there, on that corner. So you see, if you're close to that, you can see outside completely clear. So you're connected to the void. You still have your void, but you have your private space when you're further back. So you might lose the visual connection, but then you go closer, you can see through. And also, you're trying to make these bridges, like those pathway of that, which is a complete bridge there, to again penetrate the attic. Thank you for the comment.
I think the issue for me is that when I make larger kind of spatial moves, there's still something of the figure or volume that's intact. And there's a moment where when I keep operating on that skin at another scale, it starts becoming the same. You know, that actually some of this strength, let's say, of the initial moves get lost because that center cut through is no longer as strong as a figure. You know, they all start to become one language in a way. And I think that the difference between what was left of the initial skin, what was a void, and the space sort of between was strong. Yeah. And probably, you know, I think a little restraint would have helped you in terms of developing that surface.
I think part of like what you're saying with the void.
We're still trying to keep that connection that we said, and we're now seeing the service that capturing or filling that void. So, but the thing that you're saying, these two are becoming the same thing in continuing that, in
You
my
see it
point of
here.
view, yeah.
Right, like just look, you can start as far away, like if you look at your section, right, what this is and what this is are sort of replicating each other in a way, and what's happening on the outer skin and what's happening on the inside. And so I think you have to make choices, you know, about what the difference is between that kind of interior space and what's happening on the
I
exterior.
think also what was like driving it is that because we were looking at, like we created this large like glazed roof, and we did have like punch openings in a lot of our elevation with these like large span glass, is that like it's important, like in Calgary we live in a winter climate, we can't just have like a faceted, tessellated exterior where all this light is streaming in constantly when we have like thermal like air like breaks all over the place. So I think like the important part about our structure as well was that, or our exterior envelope, was that it's structural and it also is like highly insulated. So that sort of became an important point about containing these like quiet, warm spaces.
That's
you can
for sure,
still do
but
that.
No, like I agree.
completely, that's actually, that's like, it's about making decisions of legibility where that system starts and stops. It gives you, like, in this image, you can, if you squint hard enough, and even in some of these, you can see how you could regain some of that geometric legibility, and, like, you know, it seems like you need to be able to push past some of your initial sculpting exercise. So you have a choice at some point. You can either try to train the geometry to regain some of that legibility, or you can look at it and say, okay, what geometric legibility do I have remaining, and try to actually enhance that. So it actually reads like kind of like a distended system, you know, especially once you get the tower in there, right, where you know, you can imagine the tower actually has this as a structural skin system that's not volumetric and not necessarily spatial. But when it dumps out, right, the skin jumps out and then distends and becomes spatial, where it's not so much a crystal sphere inside, but it's actually a volumetric skin, and you let that remain open.
That's right.
Right, so it's you know, you like kind of here it looks like there's a skin that's becoming fat and volumetric, right? That's there. And then you want to have like that kind of crevice moving through here. So if you look closely at this, you can see there's skin behind it. But arguably, you'd want the black stuff and this stuff to be kind of doing the same thing, and let that remain. I mean, the criticism that you've gotten earlier has been about massing clarity or geometric clarity. Like there's not necessarily a geometry to the interior void versus the exterior. It's sort of amorphous. But when you start to get out to this scale, or when you're looking at your initial sculpting, it was very legible. And there's a strength and an importance to that. And you capture it in some views, but in total, you know, you can actually really edit the project to tune it up.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that I think you understand your building well enough that if this was the competition entry, and I'm the client, and I say, you're hired, but you only get half the money. Then I'd say, but go back and make it just as good as I see it right now, and give me everything that you really think is important in this. You'd still see what we're seeing, but you would refine it. So there's duplication going on, but I can still experience the pieces with less of them.
Yeah, this is the classic. At some point, you get the solution, and then you have to stop, and you have to sort of develop where you are. And I think you went a few too many steps into the process. It became so exciting that, you know, with the programs you had, you could sort of generate, okay, well, let's go another, what would happen if we did this, or, but I don't think you needed to. The other thing I'm wondering personally anyway is, part of this idea of the volume and the crystal, I think has something to do with the fact that the skin is black and the crystal is clear. If there was a closer relationship, it might feel more substantial, like the terracotta color looks thicker than the black does, and so there wouldn't be such a radical contrast between the two, because you don't even, with black you don't even see any of the shape, even though it's a three-dimensional shape. even in the sunlight. And the other part is you, relating back to your, which I applaud you for your sustainable stuff in here, that's really great. But using black skin when you're doing sustainable stuff might not be the right answer from your mechanical systems perspective. So you could probably solve or adjust your solutions slightly by just dealing with color.
I think we kind of select that color. I cannot say that it's right or wrong, but we were looking for the contrast, as I said at the beginning. So we were thinking of there is a clear crystal inside, and we're preserving it, and we're keeping it safe there inside. So we kind of mimicking the duality between interior and exterior, between physical and spiritual spaces. I don't know what's that.
But even if it's solid, you know, and I mean, it might be solid and monochromatic, et cetera, but it doesn't necessarily have to be as deliberate a contrast that becomes graphic. I think that's part of it, is that you lose the volumetric or material conditions because it starts to become a very graphic, you know, condition. And that's amplified by the thinness of the removed when it gets, you know, cut, like in those images, it starts to become almost like paper, you know, folded on that surface.
It's
But
actually really thick though.
one of the things about
I feel like it's
one of the things about your project, I think, is how evocative the images that you created are. And I think that gives the person a very real sense of the attractiveness of it. This is like a candy store with all the candy still inside, or a jewelry box with all the jewelry still there. It's very attractive, and it is very open. I think you've captured a lot of the ideas that you had initially in the final product, although the form is quite different. And so I'm less worried about the formal nature of this project now and what you might have lost along the way, because I think you gained along the way rather than losing along the way. It has a wrapped building kind of look to me, so that thinness is really there, and I think that it may be a difficulty for the longevity of the building or the future of the building, but it is really a beautiful project, and I think it creates the kind of thing that you were after. So I think in that sense it's successful. I'd like to see your drawings be much more expressive of that. For example, in your drawings, they don't have a clue of where the black is. The black is very visible on the views, but on the drawings, you have absolutely no sense of what you can see
I
through.
think that really reveals the potential to have done it in a different way. Like if it was a transformation of the same system, like let's say just closing down the apertures until it's just solid, you know, then, and if you were reading that in the plan, that likely would be legible, as opposed to just sort of saying that it's a different material system, but it's approximately the same dimension or whatever. So there's not necessarily a transformation, it's just a hard difference that you've sort of forced in there, as opposed to kind of pulled out.
This project engaged everybody, but as we need to move on, I would encourage the jurors to come closer and maybe chat with the authors while the next group sets up their.
It's a context thing about the drawings are arguably sort of preliminary working drawing type drawings. Was that on purpose, or like as opposed to having design type drawings with colored in walls and?
No, those were required at earlier stages, and at this stage, these same drawings will go to the working drawings package. So all they needed to do is in sections and elevations bring out some to show how that void works, for example. That was superimposed on something that they will do for working drawings. Again, my first working drawings package in the life. Once the drawings have to do sections, a great revelation. Thank you very much, Andrew.